Her mother-in-law poured out her medicine and locked the sick bride in the barn. The buckle on the spare bridle had been cracked since June. I kept meaning to replace it and kept not doing it. And now it was the middle of November and I was standing in the tack room in the dark holding that cracked buckle in my hand, trying to decide if I gave enough of a damn to walk to the supply shed. Cold was already coming in under the door. The kind of cold that settles in your back and stays there. I set the bridle on the peg, left it. That was what I did a lot of that autumn. Started things and set them down. My name is Cal Drennan. I was 51 years old, which felt like 65 most mornings, and I had been ramrod of the Aldgate spread for going on 9 years. Before that I'd worked 3 other outfits, 1 up in the Powder River country and 2 down here in the basin, and before all of it I'd been a corporal in a war I don't talk about anymore. Not because it left me dramatic and scarred, but because most of it was just mud and bad food and men dying of sickness instead of anything worth the story. I came out of it all right, quieter than I went in. That's all. The Aldgate Ranch was owned by a woman named Vera Aldgate, who had inherited it from her husband Harold when Harold died of a stroke 6 years prior. Vera was not a cruel woman in the way that word usually gets used. She didn't strike anyone, didn't cheat on wages, didn't work her horses to the ground. What she was hard in a way that had no bottom to it. The kind of hard that has been there so long it doesn't even know anymore that it's hard. She ran the ranch with a grip you could feel from 100 yards away, and the thing she ran it through, mostly, was her son. Nolan Aldgate, 27 years old. He had his mother's jaw and his father's wide-set eyes, and he was not a bad man. I want to say that clearly. He was just a weak one, and weakness in a man who's been handed everything has a way of curling into something meaner than it started as. He'd been drinking more in the past year. Little things going missing from the supply shed. Twice I'd found him asleep in the equipment barn when the morning work was only half done. None of that was my problem, strictly speaking. My job was the cattle and the land and the men who worked it. Nolan's private life was his own. Then in September, he came back from a trip to town with a wife. Her name was Lena Morse she'd been before that week. She was 23, a schoolteacher's daughter from a town 40 miles east, and I don't know what she thought she was getting into. Maybe she knew about Nolan's drinking. Maybe she thought she could fix it. Or maybe she just needed out of wherever she'd been and Nolan seemed like a door. I don't judge her for any of it. I just know what I saw when he brought her up to the house in the wagon and she stepped down and looked at the place. Not at the house, not at the land, just at the ground for a second, her hands folded in front of her, something going very still in her face before she put a smile on it. That look I recognized. I'd worn it a few times myself, getting off a horse somewhere new and knowing right away it was going to be harder than I'd thought. Vera met them on the porch. She shook Lena's hand the way you'd shake the hand of someone you intended to beat in a negotiation. I went back to the barn. Those first weeks I didn't think much about Lena at all. I'd see her in the yard sometimes, carrying water or taking in laundry, and I'd tip my hat and she'd nod. Polite, private. She kept to herself, which made sense. New place, new people. A mother-in-law with eyes like a hawk watching a field mouse. I had enough to manage with the fall roundup and 2 new hands who didn't know the country. What I noticed, without quite registering it, was that she worked. Not the way you work when someone's watching. The steady, quiet way, the kind that gets twice as much done. She was in the kitchen before sunup and she was still moving after supper, and she didn't make a project of it, didn't want credit. She just worked because there was work to be done. Nolan, in that same stretch, came home drunk 3 times before the month was out. The second time I heard them through the bunkhouse wall, not words, just the shape of it, his voice high and hers low, and then a door. I lay in my bunk and looked at the ceiling for a while. Then I went asleep. None of my business. The third time, Vera was there when he came in. I was crossing the yard with a coil of fence wire when I heard her voice. Not raised. Vera never raised her voice, just that flat, hard tone she had, and I kept walking. But I glanced at the kitchen window as I passed it, and I saw Lena standing at the stove with her back to the room, both hands braced on the edge of the stovetop, and her knuckles were white. I kept walking. The first cold came in the second week of October. Nothing serious, just a taste of what was coming a few nights below freezing, a rime of ice on the water troughs in the morning. The cattle got restless the way they do, feeling something shift in the season, and we moved the last of the strays down from the north pasture and did a final count. I was running on about 5 hours of sleep a night. That was normal for that time of year. The shortness of the days made everything feel like you were always behind. I noticed Lena coughing at supper one evening, a rough sound, the kind that catches in the chest. She didn't make anything of it, kept eating, and I didn't say anything, probably just the weather turning. A week later, the cough was worse. I know I was slow to see it, and I'm not proud of that. I was looking at cattle and fences, and the price of hay, and the 2 new hands who still didn't know the north water holes, and I wasn't looking at the house. Wasn't my job to look at the house. But one morning I came in for breakfast and she wasn't there, and I asked one of the other hands, a young man named Dupree, 20 years old, decent kid, where Mrs. Aldgate was, meaning Lena, and Dupree looked at his plate and said she was resting. That afternoon I was working near the house, and I heard a cough from the direction of the barn. Not the equipment barn where we kept the wagons and the tools. The old barn, the one we mostly used for overflow hay now, set back a little from the yard. I stopped, listened. There it was again, that same chest-deep cough. I walked over. The big door was closed and there was a hasp on it with a padlock through it. Padlock, on the hay barn, in the middle of the day. I stood there a minute. Then I knocked. "Mrs. Aldgate," I said. Silence for a moment, then "Mr. Drennan." Her voice was rough, not scared, just rough. "Are you—" I stopped, started again. "Is there anything you need?" A pause. "I'm all right." She didn't sound all right. She sounded like a woman who'd been sick for days and was trying to be smaller than she was. I walked back to the house. Vera was in the parlor. I stood in the doorway and she looked up from her mending. "The hay barn's padlocked," I said. "It is," she said. "Why?" "My daughter-in-law is resting there. She's sick. She has a cough." "She has more than a cough." I hadn't been a doctor ever in my life, but I'd been on enough cattle drives and seen enough men in the field go from a cough to a fever to something worse. "She needs to be inside. She needs medicine." Vera looked at me for a moment with those flat eyes. "Lena is a strong girl. She'll be fine. She'll be fine in the barn in November. She's not your concern, Cal." I looked at her. She looked at me. Vera Aldgate had a way of holding a look that said she was the one who wrote the paychecks, and we both knew it. I said, "Where's her medicine?" "She doesn't have any." "She had a tonic. I saw it in the kitchen." Vera set down her mending. "That was a waste of money, and I told Nolan so. She's not so ill she needs a tonic. She needs to stop being soft and learn the way this place works." I stood there. A lot of things went through me right then, not all of them calm things. But I was 9 years into this job, and Vera Aldgate had not crossed a line I could point to in any clear way, not yet, not technically. And I was a hired man at the end of it. And that matters, that always matters. That rope has a length to it. I said, "I'm going to give her a blanket." Vera said nothing. I went to the bunkhouse, got the spare wool blanket off the empty bunk, and walked back to the hay barn. I knocked again. Then I went around to the side where there was a gap in the boards. It was old wood, had been needing repair for 2 years, and I worked the blanket through. "There's a gap lower down," I said to the boards. "I'm pushing a blanket through." A long moment. Then I heard movement, and a hand took the end of the blanket, pulled it through. "Thank you," she said. I stood there another minute. I didn't know what else to do. Is there someone I can send word to? I said. Family. Another pause. My father is in Gunnison, but it's far. I know where Gunnison is. She didn't say anything. I said, I'm going to get you some water, and I'll figure the rest out. I walked away from the barn. Before I said anything, I'd have to account for. Here's the thing about being a ramrod on a working ranch. There are lines. They exist for real reasons, not just because somebody drew them. A hired hand who's always charging into family business is a bad hired hand. The family's troubles are the family's troubles. You're there to keep the cattle alive and the men working and the fences standing. That's the deal. You step outside it, and you've broken something that's hard to put back. I knew all of that. I also knew that the smell that had come under that barn door when I pushed the blanket through was the smell of a fever, not a mild one. I carried water to the barn twice that day, through the gap in the boards. She drank it but didn't say much. The second time I said her name and she answered immediately, but there was a thickness in her voice, the kind that comes with a fever climbing. I went to Nalin. He was in the equipment barn, doing something with a saddle that didn't need doing. He looked up when I came in and I could see right away that he'd had a drink. Not drunk, just that flatness around the eyes that comes with the first one or two. Your wife is sick, I said. He looked at his hands. My mother says it's not serious. Your mother is not a doctor, and neither am I. But I've been around enough sick people to know when a fever is getting worse. He was quiet. She needs medicine, I said. She needs to be in the house. He said, you don't know my mother. I stood there and looked at him. 27 years old. Not bad, I reminded myself. Just weak. But the two things were starting to blur. I said, then maybe her father needs to know. He looked up fast at that. I'm not making a threat, I said. I'm telling you that girl is your wife and she's sick and she's locked in a barn, and if you can't do something about it, then someone who cares about her ought to know. He went back to the saddle. I walked out. That night I went through my kit in the bunkhouse and found the small bottle of willow bark powder I kept for headaches and muscle pain, wrapped in cloth at the bottom of my pack. It wasn't medicine, not really, but it would help a fever. I also found the small tin of camphor salve, good for chest congestion. I'd had both for years, never much occasion to use them. I went to the hay barn after dark, when the yard was quiet. The lamp in the main house was on in the parlor. I went around to the side and knocked on the boards. It's Drennan, I said. Her voice came rougher than before. I know. I pushed the camphor tin through the gap, then the cloth packet of willow bark. Camphor's for your chest. Willow bark is for the fever. Mix the powder in whatever water you have. A moment. Then softly, why are you doing this? I thought about that. Because there's no reason not to, I said, which was honest but not all of it. There are reasons, she said. You could lose your job. I could. She coughed, a long, wet sound that made me want to break the padlock off the door. When it passed, she said, Thank you, Mr. Drennan. Cal, I said. Another pause, Cal. I stood there in the dark outside an old barn listening to a sick woman breathe for a little while. Then I went back to the bunkhouse. I didn't sleep much. The next morning Dupree was in the yard before breakfast, and I pulled him aside. Dupree was green, but he was decent, and he could ride. I told him I needed him to take a message to the doctor in Crestwell, which was the nearest town, 16 miles southeast. I told him what to say, and I told him not to mention it to Vera Aldgate. He looked at me a long moment. He was 20 years old. He understood what I was asking. Yes, sir, he said. He rode out before the house was awake. Vera noticed at breakfast, Where's the Dupree boy? Send him to pick up a part in Crestwell, I said. The coupling on the water pump. She looked at me. I was going to order it next week, I said, but we're going to need it before the hard freeze. She looked at me another second. Then she went back to her coffee. The doctor came that afternoon. His name was Fielding, a compact, dry man of 55 who had been working this country for 20 years and did not waste time on anything. He came up the drive in his buggy, and I met him in the yard and walked him toward the house. Vera was on the porch by the time we got there. "Mrs. Aldgate," he said. "Doctor," she said, that flat tone. "I understand there's a patient." "There's a young woman with a cough," Vera said. "I don't know who sent for you." "I did," I said. Vera looked at me, a long look, the kind that says later and means it. "I'd like to see her," Fielding said. Vera was quiet for a moment. I could see her doing the calculation. The doctor was here. There were witnesses. The story of what had been done to the girl would be easier to tell than to swallow. She said, "I'll get the key." She went inside. I let out a breath I'd been holding for about 18 hours. Fielding looked at me. "How long?" he said. 4 days in the barn, more than that sick." He pressed his lips together, said nothing else. Vera came back with the key and walked us to the barn, her back very straight, her face blank. She opened the padlock and pulled the door. The smell that came out, hay and cold air, and under that the fever smell, close and sweet-sharp, made Fielding move faster than he had before. Lena was in the far corner, sitting up against a hay bale, wrapped in the blanket I'd pushed through. She was pale the way paper is pale, and her hair was damp, and her eyes had that too bright quality a bad fever gives a person. But when we came in, she looked at me first, and then at the doctor, and what came across her face was not relief exactly. It was something quieter than relief, like she'd half stopped believing and then had to start again. Fielding crouched beside her and went to work. I stood in the doorway. I didn't look at Vera. It was pneumonia. Not the worst kind, Fielding said. The willow bark and the camphor had helped, maybe more than a little, but serious enough. She needed to be in bed, in warmth, with proper medicine for at least 2 weeks. He told Vera this directly. Vera received it the way she received everything, without expression. Then she said, "We'll see to it," and her voice was exactly the same as always, and I knew she was already working out how this had happened and who was going to pay for it. Fielding went to his buggy and came back with a brown glass bottle. "Twice a day," he told Lena. "Morning and night with water, don't skip." Lena nodded. She hadn't said much through any of it. She was watching him with those bright, sick eyes, listening to every word. Fielding stood up and looked at me. He didn't say anything, but the look said he understood, and he'd done what he could do. He left. I helped Lena to the house. She could walk, but her legs were uncertain, and she held my arm, and I kept my pace to hers. She weighed about 110 pounds, and in that moment she felt lighter than that, like something that could be easily lost if you weren't paying attention. Vera was standing in the kitchen when we came in. She looked at Lena the way you look at something you've decided what to do about. "You'll rest," Vera said, "and when you're better, we'll talk about what you've cost this household." Lena looked at her. Sick as she was, she looked at her directly, and what was in her face was not fear. It was something careful and measuring, like a woman taking the full account of something before she decided what to do about it. She said, "Yes, ma'am." But the way she said, it was not the way she'd said those words before. I got her to the spare room and she sat down on the bed, and I set the medicine bottle on the nightstand and she said, "The doctor will want to be paid." "I know," I said. "I don't have money," she said. "Don't worry about it." She looked at me, Cal. I was at the door. I turned back. She poured out my medicine, she said. "The tonic Nalin bought me. She poured it out in the yard and told me I was too soft for this country." I stood there. "I heard her lock the barn door," she said. "Nalin was in town. I don't know if he knows. I don't know if it would matter." I didn't say anything. "I just wanted you to know," she said, "in case you were wondering how far it goes." I said, "Get some rest." And I closed the door and walked back out to the yard, and I stood in the cold for a while with my hands in my pockets and the sky going orange in the west. And I thought about how far things go and where the line was, and whether I'd already crossed it. The next weeks were the hardest thing about that autumn to explain, because nothing on its surface looked different. The ranch ran the way it always ran. The men worked. The cattle were moved to the winter pastures. I fixed fence and managed feed stores and did the 100 small things that keep an outfit alive through a bad season. But underneath it, something had shifted. Vera and I didn't speak much. We'd never spoken much. That was a professional courtesy we'd both maintained for 9 years, but now the silences had weight in them. She watched me the way she'd watched me across that argument, measuring. I wasn't sure what she was measuring for. Nolan came to me 3 days after the doctor visit. He found me in the tack room. I'd finally replaced the cracked buckle, and he stood in the doorway and said, "I didn't know she was that sick." I kept working. "I know how that sounds," he said. I set down the bridle. "Nolan, what is it you want from me right now?" He was quiet a moment. Then, "I don't know. I guess I wanted you to know I didn't know." "All right," I said. "I hear you." "She's better," he said. "Lena." "She's better." "Good." He stood there a little longer and then he left and I went back to the bridle. I didn't know what to do with Nolan. I never had. There was something in him that might have gone differently with different circumstances, and that was a sad thing, but circumstances were what they were. Lena improved. Slowly, then faster. By the end of the second week she was up and moving, still careful, still with a cough that came on in the evenings, but the fever was gone and the color was back in her face. I saw her in the yard once in the 3rd week, in a heavy coat, splitting kindling. She was doing it the wrong way, all her weight in the wrong place, the axe coming down at an angle and the wood kept glancing off without splitting. I watched for a moment. Then I walked over. "May I?" said. She handed me the axe without a word. I said a piece, showed her where to stand, how to drop the weight straight down through the center of the grain, gave it back. She tried it, the wood split clean. She looked at it, then up at me. Her face was different now than it had been in September. Not harder exactly, but clearer. Like she'd looked at something directly and it hadn't broken her, and she knew now it wasn't going to. "Thank you," she said. "You're a fast learner," I said. She almost smiled. "I'm a necessary learner," she said, and picked up another piece of wood. I walked on. The thing I was not letting myself think about, I should probably explain. I am not a man who has had a great deal in his life that was easy. I don't say that for sympathy, it's just the accounting of it. I had a wife once briefly before the war, a woman named Ruth who left when I shipped out and I couldn't blame her. I had a stretch of years afterward that were worse than they needed to be, and then I found the work, the cattle, the range, the long days, and the work was honest and it didn't ask for more than I had. That suited me. I built a life around it. Quiet, manageable, mine. What I was not letting myself think about was that somewhere in the business of blankets through barn boards and willow bark powder, and standing between a sick woman and a closed door, something in me had woken up that I'd been telling myself was dead. I was 51, she was 23, she was married, she was sick. None of those things were small things, I knew that. I also knew that when I heard her cough through the wall of the hay barn, something in me had gone very still and then very certain in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Not about her, not about anything romantic. I want to be clear that I did not think of it that way, not then. Just certain that whatever needed doing, I was going to do it. Like the rest of my life had been a long, gradual narrowing, and suddenly there was one clear thing in front of me and the narrowing made sense. That's probably the best I can say it. I did not act on any of it. I treated her with the same plain decency I would have given anyone in a bad situation. I kept my distance. I did my job. But I noticed when she was in the yard. I noticed what she said and how she said it, The slight way her chin came up when she'd made a decision about something. The way she kept her hands busy when she was thinking. I noticed these things and I filed them away, and I didn't examine them. December came in cold and stayed cold. Vera fired me on a Tuesday morning. No preamble. She found me in the bunkhouse going over the winter feed tallies, and she stood in the doorway and said, "I won't be needing you after the end of the month, Cal." I looked at her. 9 years, I said. Yes. I'd like a reason. She was quiet a moment. I think you know the reason. I did my job, I said. You went around me, she said. You sent for the doctor without my permission, and you undermined my authority in my own home. Your daughter-in-law had pneumonia. She had a cough. I set down the tally book. Vera, you locked a sick woman in a barn in November. The flat eyes, she needed to learn. I looked at her for a long moment. End of the month, I said. She left. I sat there in the empty bunkhouse with the tally book in my lap and the cold coming in under the door, and I thought, all right, that's the shape of it. I'd known it was coming. Hadn't quite known when, but I'd known. You can't do what I'd done and not know. 22 days left. I went back to work. It was 3 days later that Lena knocked on the bunkhouse door at sundown. Dupree was in town, and the other hand, an older man named Ches, had already turned in. I was cleaning a rifle, just something to do with my hands. That's all it was when the knock came. I opened the door and she was standing in the dark in her coat, her breath coming in small white clouds, and she said, "Can I talk to you?" "Come in," I said. She came in, looked at the lamp, the bunk, the rifle on the table, the same tack room smell that drifts into any bunkhouse. She didn't sit. She stood near the door with her hands folded. "She told me," Lena said. I waited. "She told me she let you go. End of the month. Because of me. Because I went around her." "Same thing," she said. "Not quite." She looked at me. Her face was still thinner from the sickness, but the eyes were clear. "I'm going to talk to her," she said. I wouldn't. "She'll listen to me." "She won't," I said. "Vera doesn't change her mind about things, you know that." "She might." "Lena," I picked up the cleaning cloth and set it down. "Don't fight this on my behalf. The situation is what it is. I've been let go before and I'll land on my feet. I always have." She looked at me for a long moment. "You've been doing this 9 years, she said. "And before that something else. That's how it goes. This is your home." I almost said that it wasn't, that it was a job and jobs end. But I stopped, because the word had hit something and I didn't want her to see it land. "Go inside," I said. "It's cold." She didn't move. "I'm going to leave him," she said. I looked at her. "Nolan," she said, "I've been thinking about it since the barn. He knew I was sick and he stayed in town. He knew what his mother is like and he just let it go." She stopped, started again. "I came here with almost nothing and I thought, I don't know what I thought, that it would get better, that he'd come around." She shook her head. "He's not going to come around." "That's your business," I said carefully. "I know it is." She looked at the floor for a second, then back up. "I'm telling you because you've been honest with me and I want to be honest with you." I stood there. "I have a little money saved," she said. "Enough to get to my father's in Gunnison, maybe, if I'm careful. I've been writing to him." "Your father knows." "He knows enough." She paused. "I wasn't asking you anything, Cal. I just wanted you to know that what happened in the barn, what you did, it mattered to me. It matters more than you know, and I didn't want to leave without saying that plainly." She looked at me when she said it. Not soft, not sideways, just directly. The way she'd looked at Vera Aldgate across the kitchen, that same clear, direct, careful look, but without the carefulness this time, just the clarity. Something went through me that I wasn't ready for. "You've still got time to think about it," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. About Nolan, about what you do next. I've thought about it, she said. All right. She looked at me one more moment. Then she said, "Good night, Cal," and she walked back out into the cold. I stood there in the open door a while, watching the dark. The last 2 weeks of December were the longest of my life, and I've had some long stretches. I went about my work. I wrote letters to 2 outfits I knew of, one up toward the Yellowstone and one down in the San Luis Valley, inquiring about work in the spring. I got one reply. It was cautious but promising. Lena and I didn't speak much during those weeks. She was in the house and I was in the yard, and we moved in parallel the way people do when there's something between them that isn't being spoken. She was careful. I was careful. We were both very careful. But she brought coffee to the yard once when I was mending the corral gate, which she had no reason to do. And once when I was looking over the winter pasture fence and the cold was sharp enough to sting, I turned and she was crossing the yard to the woodpile, and she stopped for a moment and looked at me from across the distance, and we just stood like that, not long, 5 seconds maybe, before she went on to the woodpile. Nolan drank through Christmas. Vera managed the household with her usual iron competence and did not speak to me unless the work required it. On the 28th, 3 days before my last day, I was in the equipment barn checking the wagon axles when I heard the main house door and then raised voices. Not shouting. Vera didn't shout, but raised, the kind that carry. I went still and listened. Nolan's voice higher than usual, Vera's flat and steady, and under them quieter but not backing down Lena's. I couldn't make out words, just the shape and the push of it. Then the door again, harder this time. I went back to the axle. An hour later, Lena came to the barn. I was under the wagon. I heard her boots and looked out. She told him, Lena said. Her voice was controlled in the way a voice is controlled when someone is managing something just barely. About you being let go. He didn't know. Doesn't change anything, I said. He argued with her, she said. Nolan argued with her. I don't think he's ever argued with her. I came out from under the wagon and looked at her. Her jaw was set, and her eyes were a little too bright, but she was holding it. He's not going to win that argument, I said. No, she said, he's not, but he tried. She looked at her hands. That's something, I guess. I didn't know what it was. I said, did she change her mind? No. I nodded. I told her, Lena said, that if you went, I was going. I looked at her. She said that was my business, Lena said, with a short, hard sound that wasn't quite a laugh. So, I stood there with the grease rag in my hand, and I looked at this woman, thin from sickness still, color coming back, jaw set, some inner thing in her that had been resolving itself across the past 3 months, and I said the wrong thing first, which was, "You don't have to do that." She looked at me like I'd said something almost worth laughing at. "Cal," she said, patient, like she was explaining something. "I was going anyway. I told you. I am going to Gunnison, to my father, and then I am going to figure out what comes next." She paused. "I just also told Vera that I would go when you did because she should know the cost. That's not the same thing as doing it for you." I nodded. "All right," I said, "fair." "But," she said, and she stopped. I waited. She looked at me for a moment in the dim barn, the winter light coming through the cracks in the boards, and she said, "If there's a chance you'd be going anywhere near Gunnison." I stood very still. "The San Luis Valley is south of there," I said. "I know where the San Luis Valley is," she said. Quiet in the barn, wind working at the boards. "If you were going that direction anyway," she said, "I'd feel better not traveling alone. That's a long way in December." I said I was going that direction. She looked at me. Her eyes were very direct. "It would be practical," she said. "Very practical," I said. She almost smiled, not quite but close. "January 2nd, she said. "I told my father January 2nd. January 2nd, I said. She gave one short nod, like something had been settled, and walked back to the house. I stood there in the cold barn and realized I was holding the grease rag in both hands like I was trying to wring it out. My last day on the Aldgate spread was New Year's Eve. I finished the winter tallies, made sure Dupree knew where everything was, and what needed watching in the deep cold, and how the north water holes froze in a particular order you had to know to break them right. Dupree was 20 and green, but he was honest and he paid attention, and I thought the place would be all right with him, at least until Vera hired a real ramrod come spring. I settled up with Vera in the parlor. She paid me what was owed to the cent. That was her way. Whatever else she was scrupulously fair about money. 9 years, I said for the second time. She looked at me. You made your choice, she said. I did, I said. I almost asked her if she understood what she'd done to that girl in the barn, and why it had mattered, and what kind of person it took to pour medicine out in the dirt and put a padlock on a door with a sick woman behind it. But I already knew the answer, and the answer was that Vera Aldgate understood it completely and had done it anyway, because she believed it was the right kind of lesson for the right kind of wife, and nothing I could say was going to change that understanding. So I took my money, and I shook her hand and I walked out. Nolan was in the yard. He was standing by the fence, looking out at the winter pasture, and he had both hands in his coat pockets, and he wasn't drinking, which I counted for something. He looked up when I came out. Cal, he said. Nolan. He was quiet a moment, then, I'm sorry about how it went. I looked at him. Weak man, probably always going to be a weak man, but standing here in the cold on the last day trying to say something true. I thought about what he might have been with a different hand, a different mother, different luck. All right, I said, take care of yourself. I picked up my gear. We left January 2nd, just after first light. Lena was at the gate with a small trunk and a satchel. Dupree had helped her get them to the yard the evening before, and I'd loaded them in the wagon. Nolan had not come out of the house. Vera was at the kitchen window when I rode past. She watched without expression, and I tipped my hat, because 9 years was 9 years. The first hour was cold and quiet. The snow from the last storm was a week old, and the road was hard-packed, and the horses moved at a good pace. Lena sat beside me on the wagon seat in her heavy coat with a blanket over her lap, and she didn't say much. I didn't say much. The valley was very white and very still in the early cold, the kind of cold that makes sound carry, and somewhere far off a hawk called once and then silence. After a while she said, "Thank you for driving." "It's the same direction," I said. "It's still a kindness." I let that sit. A mile further she said, "How are you feeling about it?" "About what?" "About leaving." I thought about that honestly. "Relieved," I said, "mostly, and tired in the way you're tired when something's been hard for a long time without you quite admitting it." She nodded. "That's how I feel too." We rode on. The country opened up as we got further from the basin, the mountains coming around the south in a long blue wall, and the road dropped toward a creek that would be frozen hard for another 2 months. My horses knew this road. The older one, a gray named Patterson, had been on it a dozen times, and he walked it with authority. I was watching the country the way you do when you've been on a place long enough to know it by feel, and you're leaving, taking inventory. Not sad exactly, but careful, like putting a thing down carefully because you might never pick it up again. "Tell me about the San Luis Valley," she said. I glanced at her. "What about it?" "What it's like." "Flat," I said, "wider than this, further from the mountains, but you can still see them on 3 sides if the weather's right. Good grass in the summer, cold in winter, but a different cold, drier, not as heavy. And the outfit you're riding to. The Greer Ranch, good-sized, probably 300 head going into winter, more in summer. I've known of them for years, good reputation." She was quiet, considering this. And if they don't want you, she said, not unkindly, just plainly, then I'll find something else. There's always work for a man who can do it. You're not worried? I thought about it, not much. She looked at me sideways. You trust yourself, she said. I said I trust the work, the rest sorts itself. She looked back at the road, and then, quietly, like she wasn't sure she was saying it out loud, I want to trust myself like that. I waited. I keep going back over it, she said, thinking about all the things I should have seen before I married him, all the things I talked myself out of seeing. And I know I can't fix that now. I know the thing to do is just go forward, but it keeps, she stopped. It keeps catching. That's how it catches, I said, for a while. Does it stop? Mostly. She looked at her hands. I made a foolish choice. You were 22, I said. That's not an excuse. No, but it's a reason. She was quiet a moment. How do you know how old I was? I don't, I said, I guessed. She almost smiled. 23, she said. Still. She looked back at the mountains. I was going to say that I'm not the kind of woman who needs someone to rescue her, she said. And then I thought about the barn, and I thought that maybe that's not quite true. You didn't need rescuing, I said. You needed someone to not look the other way. She was quiet. There's a difference, I said. She looked at me. Her face was very still and very direct, and what was in it was something I hadn't seen directed at me in a very long time, maybe ever. The particular look of someone who is deciding to believe what they're hearing, deciding to let it in, and knowing exactly what that costs. Thank you, she said, for not looking the other way. I watched the road. I'm glad I didn't, I said. And that was all that got said for a while, but it was enough. We made Crestwell before dark and put up at the inn there, separate rooms. She had a little money and I had mine. The inn was warm and smelled of wood smoke, and the woman who ran it, a stout widow named Abernathy, fed us beef stew and cornbread without asking a lot of questions, which I appreciated. Lena ate all of hers and asked for more, which I took as a good sign. Her cough was mostly gone now, but it came back some in the cold, and I'd been watching it. She caught me watching at one point and said, I'm fine, and I said, I know, and she said, you keep checking, and I said, old habit, and she said, of checking on things, and I said, of things that need it. And she looked at me for one of those moments that are longer than they look, and then she went back to her stew. After supper, she said she was going to write to her father, let him know when to expect us. You can say the end of the week, I said, depending on the weather. She nodded. Then, I'll tell him I'm traveling with a friend. I said that's accurate. She looked at me. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Yes, she said, it is. She went to her room. I sat by the fire for a while and drank 1 cup of coffee and thought about accuracy and friendship and the gap between them, and then I went to sleep. The road south was 3 days through country that got wilder and lonelier as you went. There was a stretch on the second day where we didn't see another person for 4 hours, and the only sounds were the horses and the wind working through the sage, and once, far off, what might have been a wolf. We talked more on that stretch than we had before. I'm not sure why. Maybe because there was no one to hear. She told me about her father, a gentle, bookish man, she said, who had raised her alone after her mother died when Lena was 9, and who had been uncertain about Nalan from the start but had ultimately trusted her judgment because she was 23 and said she was in love. Were you? I said. She thought about it. I thought I was. I thought he was kind and he seemed to need me, and that felt like the same thing. It's not the same thing. No, she said, I know that now. She asked me about my wife, Ruth. I told her a little, not everything, but the honest shape of it. A young man going to war, a woman who couldn't wait, the end of something before it had a chance to become anything. You never remarried, she said. Never found the occasion. Is that the truth? I looked at her. Mostly, I said. She looked back at the road. What's the other part? I got good at being alone, I said. It's a bad habit, comfortable but bad. She was quiet a moment. I understand that, she said. You're 23. I've been alone in a house full of people for 3 months, she said. That's a fast way to learn it. I looked at the road. I suppose it is. We rode on. The San Luis Valley opened up on the third morning, just as I'd said, flat and wide. The mountains on 3 sides in the clear, cold air. The whole thing still and enormous under a gray sky. Lena looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. It's bigger than I expected, she said. It does that. Is it always this quiet? In winter, I said. In summer there's more wind, different sounds. She looked at it a while longer. Then, I could see living somewhere like this. I watched her watching the valley. I didn't say anything. But I noted it. Her father's place was a small house at the edge of the town of Mineral Springs, which was a modest thing of maybe 400 souls with a general store and a church and a telegraph office, and not much else. The house had a porch and a good chimney, and a light in the window when we came up the road in the early afternoon. He came out before we stopped the wagon. A small, white-haired man, not old but well along, with Lena's eyes and the look of a man who's been worried for weeks and trying to keep it contained. He got to her before I'd finished setting the brake, and she stepped down and he held her by both arms and looked at her face for a moment. The way you look at something you thought you might have lost, taking inventory. You're thin, he said. I'm better than I was, she said. He pulled her in. She pressed her face against his shoulder, and for a moment I saw her hands grip the back of his coat, and something in her that had been held very carefully for months simply let go. I busied myself with the horses. After a while she came and stood beside me, red-eyed but composed. Come inside, she said. He'll want to thank you. He doesn't have to. He will anyway. Her father's name was Martin Morse, and he made the best coffee I'd had in a month, and he thanked me in a plain, direct way that didn't have flattery in it, and I respected that. We sat at his kitchen table, and the stove was hot, and outside the light was going, and Martin asked me careful questions about what I planned to do next, and I told him about the Greer outfit, and he nodded like a man who knows how to listen to another man's plans without intruding on them. At one point he got up to check the stove and Lena was quiet for a moment, and she looked at me across the table, and what was in her face was a thing I had not known quite what to do with since the night she'd stood in the bunkhouse doorway. A look that was not asking anything and not performing anything, just saying something very clearly without words, and what it said was, I see you. Clearly, without softening it. All of you that you've shown me and some you haven't. I have been looked at in a lot of ways over the course of my life. That look I had not been given before. Not like that. I looked back. Martin came back with more coffee, and we talked about the winter until the light was fully gone. I stayed 3 days. In the morning of the first day I rode out to the Greer outfit, 6 miles east. The foreman there was a man named Beaumont, 45, weathered, the kind of man who asks one real question and listens to the whole answer. He looked me over, asked about my last outfit, and I told him the truth in plain terms. 9 years, good record, let go at the end on account of a disagreement about how a sick woman was treated. I said it plainly, and I let him think what he wanted. He said, Vera Aldgate's place. I said, yes. He said, I know her reputation. He hired me to start in March. I rode back to town with a lightness in my chest that I hadn't had in a while. Not happiness, exactly. I didn't trust happiness. It had a way of outlasting itself, but something solid. Ground under me. A next thing. Lena and Martin were both at the table when I came in, papers spread out, something to do with her father's accounts. She looked up when I came through the door and I said, March 1st, and she said, good, and her father said, sit down, there's stew. The second day I helped Martin with some work around the house. a door that had come loose from its frame, a leaky seam in the roof over the back porch. He was not a handyman. He watched me work and handed me things and asked questions about the country to the south and how the Greer outfit was organized, and I told him what I knew. At one point he said, careful, not looking at me, "Lena says you were good to her on the road." "It was the same direction," I said. He was quiet a moment. "She says more than that." I handed him a hammer to hold and didn't say anything. "She's not foolish," he said. "In spite of how it looked with Nalin, she had reasons for that and they made a kind of sense at the time. She's not foolish." "I know she's not foolish," I said. Another quiet moment. "She'll be looking for work," he said. "School teaching, probably. There might be a position in Mineral Springs, there might not. She'll figure it out. She's capable." "I know she's capable," I said. He handed me back the hammer. "I just wanted you to know," he said. "That's all." He went inside. I finished the roof. The third morning was the morning I was supposed to leave for the Greer outfit. They had a bunkhouse and I could stay there through the winter, helping with what needed doing before the spring operation began. I'd said I'd come early. Beaumont had seemed pleased. I loaded my gear into the wagon before first light. Lena came out when the sky was just going gray, in her coat with a shawl over it, and she stood in the yard while I worked. She didn't say anything, neither did I for a while. Then I tied off the last rope and I turned around. She was looking at me with that look again, straight and clear and without performance. "I want to say something," she said. "All right." "I want to say it plainly," she said. "Because I think you and I understand each other well enough for that." "All right," I said again. She said, "I'm going to be here a while, getting myself sorted, finding work, figuring out the legal business with Nalin, which is going to take time. My father's a patient man and he's glad to have me." She paused. "And I know you're 6 miles east, and I know you're not a man who comes calling on women who are in the middle of sorting themselves out, because that's who you are." I said nothing. "But I wanted you to know," she said, "that when I am sorted, if you were still of a mind, I wouldn't turn you away." The cold was very clean. The sky was starting to show pink over the eastern mountains. I looked at her for a long moment. She didn't look away, didn't soften it or hedge it. Just stood there in the early gray light with her hands folded, and her chin at that slight upward angle, and waited. Here is what I knew about Lena Morse by that point in January. She had been sick in a barn and not broken. She had been overlooked and managed around, and she had not become bitter or small. She had looked at Vera Aldgate's flat iron will and measured it plainly and made her decision and walked. She had ridden 3 days in the cold and eaten stew with a stranger's family and written letters and made plans and been afraid, probably, plenty of times, and not let the fear run the show. She was 23, I was 51, those numbers were real. And I had been good at being alone for a very long time. That was real too. But she was standing in the gray cold saying she would not turn me away plainly, without softening it, looking me straight in the eye. And she had the look of a woman who had made a careful decision and meant to stand by it. I said, "I'll be in for supper on Friday, if that's all right." Something came into her face. Not relief, she hadn't been nervous in the way that produces relief, just something that settled, something that looked like, yes, that's right, that's how it should go. "Friday," she said. I got up on the wagon. She came to the side of it and she reached up and she put her hand on my arm, just briefly, just a moment, her hand through my coat sleeve, a small firm pressure, and she looked up at me, and in the early light her eyes were very clear, and what was in them was exactly what I'd been trying not to let myself see for 3 months, and it was not soft and it was not sorry for anything, and it was entirely for me. I covered her hand with mine for a second, both of us just standing there in the cold. Then I picked up the reins. "Friday," I said. She stepped back. I turned Patterson south and started down the road, and when I looked back once she was still in the yard, standing in the gray morning light, watching me go, and her arms were at her sides and her chin was up, and she was not waving, just watching, steady and sure, the way you watch something you intend to still be there for. The Greer bunkhouse was warm and the men were decent and the work started right away, which was what I needed. I thought about her more than I planned to. Not in a mooning way, not in a way that interfered with anything. I was past 50 and I'd been alone long enough to know the difference between feeling something and being run by it. But she was there, in the back of my thinking, the same way a thing is there when you know it's real. Solid. Not going anywhere. Friday I rode the 6 miles in the last of the afternoon light, and Martin met me at the door with the look of a man who'd been expecting me and had decided to be all right about it. Lena was in the kitchen, and when I came in, she looked up from what she was doing and she smiled. Not the almost smile she'd been using since September, the careful one, but a real one, full just briefly, before she went back to what she was making. That was the thing that got me. That smile, and the way it came and went like she had no intention of performing it, just couldn't help it. We ate supper, the 3 of us. Martin talked a lot, which I think was his way of giving us cover. After supper, he went to his room early, citing a book he was reading, and Lena and I sat at the kitchen table with our coffee and talked until the fire was low. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make a story if you tried to tell it. Just talk. The easy kind, the kind where you're not working at it. She told me about the teaching position. There might be one, come spring. The current schoolteacher's wife was expecting a second child and they might be moving on. I told her about the Greer cattle, the layout of the land, what the spring roundup would look like. She asked good questions and listened to the answers, and when she had opinions, she said them plainly. At some point, we'd stopped talking and were just sitting there in the quiet of the low fire, and I was aware of how close she was, the small sounds of the house settling in the cold, and she was looking at her coffee cup with a small private expression that I would have given a lot to understand. She looked up and found me watching her. She didn't look away. "You're going to be stubborn about this, aren't you?" she said. "About what?" "About going slow," she said. "About doing everything the right way. About not—" She stopped. The corner of her mouth moved. "About not making any moves that a man of your character wouldn't make." "That sounds like a complaint," I said. "It's not," she said. "It's just I see it. I see you deciding at every turn to be careful and right and decent." She paused. "You've been doing it for 3 months. There were reasons for 3 months. There were," she said, "and you were right about every one of them." "But," I said. She looked at me. "The reasons are different now," I said. "They are," she said. The fire made a small sound. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine, the same way I had in the yard that morning, but this time I kept it there. She turned her hand over under mine, and her fingers found my fingers, and she held on. Her grip was firm and unhurried, the grip of someone who has decided and is not going back from it. She looked at me across the table. In the firelight, her face was very still and very sure, and what was in her eyes was the same thing I'd seen in the yard, that clear, direct, certain thing that was entirely for me, and making no attempt to be anything else. "I see what you are," she said quietly. "I saw it in the barn, I saw it on the road. You did every hard thing quietly and you never asked for anything back and you thought I didn't notice." She paused. I noticed. I couldn't say anything for a moment. "You don't have to be careful anymore," she said. "Not with me." I looked at her, 51 years old, a long way from where I'd started and a longer way from where I'd thought I'd end up. Her hand in mine, the fire low, the cold pressing at the windows, and a woman looking at me with the particular clear look of someone who has seen you honestly and is choosing you anyway. Not because you're what she expected or what she planned for, but because you're what's real. I said, "I'm not the easiest man." "I know," she said. "I know what you are." "I'm 28 years older." I know how to count, she said. I looked at her. Cal, she said, and the way she said it, just my name, plain, no weight on it except the weight of meaning it, did something to the last of the wall I'd been keeping. All right, I said. Not a grand thing, just those 2 words and her hand in mine and the fire. That was the winter. Spring came in slow and then fast, the way it does out there. Weeks of mud and then one day the grass just there, green and real, like it had been waiting all along. She got the teaching position. 8 children, a small schoolroom, a modest salary that she was absurdly pleased about. I'd ride the 6 miles in on Fridays, and we'd sit at Martin's table and talk, and Martin would go to bed early with his books, and eventually I stopped being the guest and started just being there the way you're somewhere you belong. We didn't rush anything. She'd been through enough hurrying, and I had been alone long enough to know that the right kind of thing didn't need pushing, it just needed room. By the time the summer range work began, when the Greer outfit was moving cattle up to the high pastures, and I was back to the long days, the life I was going back to at the end of each week was not the bunkhouse and the careful nothing of it. It was a lamp in a window and a woman with her chin up and clear eyes, and a hand that held mine without asking for anything except that I keep holding on. Which I intended to do. I'm sitting on Martin's porch right now, writing this, him inside with his books, the valley going golden in the late light, the mountains still holding snow on the north faces even this late in June. In a little while she'll come out with coffee, the way she does, and she'll sit beside me, and we'll watch the light go. I was ramrod for 9 years on a place that let me go, and for a time I thought that was my whole accounting, useful, competent, replaceable. She showed me it wasn't. Not by telling me, by choosing, plainly, directly, with her eyes open, knowing exactly what she was choosing. That's worth more than any amount of being told. The coffee will come and she'll sit down, and the valley will go dark by degrees, and the stars out here are something. You can't know how many there are until you're somewhere without walls and without noise, and without the weight of someone else's opinion of who you are. I know who I am now. She looked at me until I did. That's enough.